Right now, as you watch this, Southern Europe is experiencing heat for which climate records lack a precedent to describe it accurately. In Seville, the thermometer read 46.2 degrees Celsius at 3:37 p.m. this afternoon. In Lisbon, the University Botanical Garden, one of Portugal's oldest weather stations, with records dating back to 1863, has just recorded the highest temperature in 163 years of continuous measurement. In Greece, the island of Rhodes, which burned for weeks last summer, is now at 44 degrees Celsius with 62% relative humidity, a combination that doctors call the physiological death zone. And the Copernicus Climate Change Service confirmed yesterday, in technically restrained but devastatingly clear language, that this is the 14th consecutive hottest month on record globally since humans began measuring the Earth's temperature with instruments. 14 months, in a row, without a single month of relief. And what the models show for the coming weeks is something European meteorologists are discussing in private groups, using language they don't use in public. In this video, I'll show you what's really happening in Europe right now, not the two-paragraph summary you read on the news site this morning. I'll cover what's happening in Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Greece, and the Balkans. I'll explain the science behind this atmospheric block that's trapping heat over the continent, and I'll show you why the consequences of this heat wave don't end when the thermometer drops, because they don't. No speculation, no dramatization, just the facts, the science, and what's really at stake. Before I continue, if you're in any of these regions right now, or have family there, tell me in the comments what you're going through. I don't want an opinion, I want your story. What you've seen, what you've felt, what your family is facing. Real stories in the comments. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Not for my sake, but so the algorithm will show this video to those in the affected areas who need this information. And if this video reaches 8,000 likes, I'll post a special update in the coming days with the latest data from the ECMWF models. 8,000. Let's do this. I'll start with where the crisis is most acute right now, and where the contrast between what's happening and what should be happening is most striking. Spain. More specifically, the Guadiana River Basin in the southwest of the country, and the city of Badajoz in Extremadura, a region whose very name evokes the idea of an extreme frontier, and which is now experiencing something that goes beyond any boundary that climatologists have drawn as a safety limit. To understand why the number I'm about to give you is devastating, I first need you to understand what happens to the human body when the ambient temperature exceeds skin temperature. Most people think that extreme heat is uncomfortable, that it makes you dizzy, that it makes you sweat a lot. This is true up to a certain temperature, but there is a threshold, around 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature, a concept I'll explain in detail later, below which the human body can regulate itself indefinitely through sweating, and above which the human body begins to accumulate heat faster than it can dissipate it, regardless of how much water you drink or whether you stay in the shade. Above that threshold, time is the only factor that determines whether you survive. And in Badajoz, over the past 6 days, the wet bulb temperature has consistently ranged between 32 and 34 degrees Celsius during peak hours, dangerously close to that limit, with nighttime lows that never dropped below 28 degrees Celsius. What this means in practice, the elderly, farm workers, and young children in Extremadura have not had a single night of physiological recovery in 6 days. Each morning began with a body already overwhelmed by the previous day. AMET, Spain's state meteorological agency, issued a red alert for 17 provinces simultaneously, the highest number of simultaneous red alerts in the history of the Spanish warning system, which has been in place since 2003. The Spanish Ministry of Health confirmed 847 heat-related deaths in just the first 4 days of this heat wave. But there is one piece of data that official reports are not including in the tally. A senior epidemiologist at the Spanish National Institute of Health, who asked not to be identified because, in his words, official communication regarding this crisis is being managed to avoid causing panic, and I am not authorized to contradict the institutional narrative, told me that the official figures capture only deaths where hyperthermia was certified as the direct cause. Deaths from heart failure in patients with pre-existing cardiovascular conditions exacerbated by the heat, deaths from kidney failure, and deaths of people found alone at home 3 or 4 days later. These fall into other categories. The actual number, he said, is probably 3 times what is being reported, 300%, and the official death toll of 847 already exceeds the total heat-related deaths recorded in Spain in 2022, which was until now the deadliest year in the country's modern history for this type of event. 847 families, 847 people who went to the market, who had plans for the weekend, who texted their children last week, and who are no longer here because the planet got too hot and the protective infrastructure couldn't keep up. And here is the element that transforms this event from a tragedy into a scandal. Spain's response infrastructure was, by definition, prepared for the past. The warning systems, the contingency plans, the stockpiles of medications for heat emergencies, all calibrated based on the most extreme events of the past 30 years. But the past 30 years no longer serve as a benchmark for planning. What used to be a once-in-a-generation event has become a once-a-summer event. And the institutional framework has not yet absorbed this shift in scale. France was the model that Europe chose as a success story after 2003. That summer, 15,000 French people died in less than 2 weeks during a heat wave that the country's healthcare system simply did not know how to recognize as a medical emergency. Elderly people in Paris died alone in apartments, with the windows closed because French summer culture lacked the tools to deal with what was happening. It was a national trauma, and the French response to that trauma was one of the most serious and systematic that any European country has ever implemented in response to a climate-related event. The French government created the National Heat Action Plan, in French, the PNAC, which includes a mandatory registration system for vulnerable individuals in every municipality. Municipal cooling centers open with extended hours during alerts, protocols for home visits by health workers to older adults registered as living alone, and a 4-level alert system, green, yellow, orange, and red, with automatic triggers for action at each level. It sounds bureaucratic when described this way. In practice, in 2019, when an equally intense heat wave struck France with temperatures of 45.9 degrees Celsius in Galargues-le-Montueux, a French all-time record, the death toll was 1,500 people. Still tragic, but 10 times lower than in 2003, during an event of comparable intensity. The difference between the 15,000 deaths in 2003 and the 1,500 in 2019 was not the weather. The weather was equally brutal on both occasions. The difference lay in what human beings built and organized in the 16 years between the two events. And the question hanging in the air during this 2026 heat wave is, why didn't Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Italy do the same after seeing what France learned the hard way? The answer is a long one. It involves budgets, political priorities, and the eternal underestimation of the coming summer. But it is an answer that will cost a few hundred more lives before anyone decides to give it. What is happening in Spain and Portugal is the epicenter, but the phenomenon extends across a geographic area that makes this heat wave qualitatively different from previous ones. Italy is experiencing its own version of this crisis. In Rome, the thermometer at Ciampino Airport, the World Meteorological Organization's reference station for the Italian capital, reached 43.7 degrees Celsius on July 9th, the highest temperature ever recorded in the city in 150 years of measurements. To understand why Rome is particularly vulnerable, you need to understand the dense urbanization of its historic center. Rome has between 2.8 and 3.2 million residents in its metropolitan area, with a building density in the center that dates back centuries. Stone, marble, and volcanic basalt cobblestones, surfaces that absorb heat during the day and radiate it at night. The urban heat island effect in Rome raises the temperature of the historic center by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius above that of outlying areas. In the coming days, with the atmospheric block showing little sign of shifting, ECMWF models project that Rome could exceed 45 degrees Celsius for the first time in its documented history. In Greece, the situation has an additional dimension that the rest of Europe does not face with the same intensity: tourism. In July 2026, approximately 4.2 million foreign tourists are spread across the Greek islands and the mainland, people from northern European countries, Canada, and the United States, who are not physiologically acclimated to these temperatures and who often arrive in the Mediterranean precisely on the worst days of the heat wave, unaware of what they will encounter. The Greek National Meteorological Service, EMY, has issued specific alerts for the Dodecanese Islands, Rhodes, Kos, Simi, where temperatures combined with humidity are creating wet bulb conditions that emergency physicians classify as dangerous for anyone not acclimated to the climate. Local hospitals on these islands were designed for winter populations of tens of thousands, not for the summer influxes of hundreds of thousands. In Rhodes, the Andreas Papandreou General Hospital has activated its maximum emergency protocol, with stretchers lining the hallways and doctors working 20-hour shifts. Further north, France, despite its superior response system, is facing the heat wave spread to regions that historically rarely experienced events of this intensity. The city of Lyon, nestled between the Saône and Rhône rivers in southeastern France, recorded 41.2 degrees Celsius, tying its all-time record, with the difference that this time the heat is persisting for more consecutive days than in any previous event. Alsace, in the northeast, reached 39 degrees Celsius, a temperature that 10 years ago would have been considered impossible for that latitude. In Paris, Mayor Anne Hidalgo activated the orange level of the PNOC, opening 149 cooling centers and mobilizing 3,200 health workers for home visits. In Germany, the German Weather Service, DWD, Deutscher Wetterdienst, issued extreme heat warnings for the entire Rhine Basin and for the states of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg. Munich, which in 2019 recorded 40.3 degrees Celsius for the first time in its history, is now treating such occurrences as part of what climatologists describe as the normalization of the exceptional, a concept that should alarm anyone who understands what it means. In the Netherlands, the KNMI, the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute, is monitoring the temperature of the Rhine near the German border. When the river gets too hot, the nuclear power plants that use its water for cooling are forced to reduce output, just when demand for electricity for air conditioning is at its peak. It's a thermodynamic paradox that the European energy system has not yet resolved. To understand why this specific heat wave in July 2026 is different from the hot summers that existed before climate change, you need to understand three mechanisms that are operating simultaneously, and which combined create something qualitatively new. Most people think a heat wave is simply a period of hot days, that the air has gotten hot, that it becomes uncomfortable, and that it passes. But what is happening now in Europe is an atmospheric block, a phenomenon far more persistent and far more dangerous than a simple passing mass of hot air. An atmospheric block occurs when the normal flow of the jet stream, the high-altitude wind current that typically circulates from west to east in the northern hemisphere, carrying low-pressure systems and rain to Europe, becomes abnormally slow and meandering. When this happens, high-pressure systems become trapped in place, like a cork blocking the flow. The air beneath a high-pressure system compresses and heats up as it descends, a process called adiabatic subsidence. The surface receives this already warm air, which in turn heats up even more upon contact with the dry ground, and the heat builds up. There is no passing wind to dissipate the heat, no rain for evaporative cooling, and no cool nights because the ground has stored so much heat during the day that it continues to radiate for hours after sunset. This is the heat dome, not a physical dome, but a thermodynamic trap. And the central question of 2026 is, why is the jet stream behaving this way? The answer lies in the Arctic. Global warming is not uniform. The Arctic is warming 2 to 4 times faster than the global average. This reduces the temperature gradient between the Arctic and the tropics, which is precisely what keeps the jet stream stable and fast. With this reduced gradient, the jet stream becomes weaker, slower, and more prone to these extreme wavels that create persistent blockings. It's a feedback loop. More global warming, a warmer Arctic, a weaker jet stream, more blockings, more heat waves, more global warming. The cycle has no natural reversal within the relevant human planning horizon. But what makes this 2026 heat wave especially lethal is not just the air temperature. It is the wet bulb temperature, a number most people have never heard of, but which is, literally, the difference between life and death. The wet bulb temperature is a combined measure of temperature and humidity that represents the limit of the human body's ability to cool itself through perspiration. Sweating cools the body because water evaporates, and evaporation consumes energy, heat. But if the air is already saturated with moisture, evaporation slows down. If the air is completely saturated, evaporation stops. And if the wet bulb temperature exceeds 35 degrees Celsius, the human body cannot cool itself, even by sweating as much as it possibly can. This is the absolute physiological threshold. Above a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, a healthy person at rest and properly hydrated begins to accumulate heat in the body's core at a rate that will lead to death in less than 6 hours. In the parts of southern Spain and Greece most affected at the moment, wet bulb temperatures did not reach 35 degrees Celsius, but they did reach 33 and 34 degrees Celsius, which is enough to kill the elderly, young children, people with cardiovascular or kidney disease, and anyone who has to work outdoors. And here's the point that news reporting rarely explains. Every tropical night, defined as a night with a low above 20 degrees Celsius, deprives the body of its recovery window. After 6 consecutive tropical nights, an elderly person without air conditioning, who seems just tired, may in fact be experiencing progressive organ failure, without external symptoms that any layperson in the family could recognize as a medical emergency. Conventional journalism will cover the deaths from this heat wave, the numbers that governments will confirm in the coming weeks. What is rarely covered is what comes after the heat. And this is where the story gets really complicated. The first set of consequences is what you see in the headlines: deaths from hyperthermia, hospital admissions, and the collapse of emergency care capacity. Hospitals in Spain, Greece, and Italy are reporting emergency room lines with wait times of 6 to 8 hours in regions that normally have wait times of 1 or 2 hours. Healthcare workers who should be responding to the emergency are themselves suffering from the heat because older hospitals, built in the 1950s and 1960s, have air conditioning systems inadequate for the temperatures of 2026. Firefighters battling wildfires, and there are simultaneous wildfires raging in Catalonia, the Greek Peloponnese, and Sardinia, Italy, are working in heat that puts them at risk of collapsing before they can bring the fires under control. But that's not the end of the chain. The second set of consequences begins to emerge when you look at agriculture. The Ebro Basin in Spain and the Po Valley in Italy are two of the most productive breadbaskets in Mediterranean Europe. Both are suffering from severe water stress. European corn, which is a summer crop, requires specific amounts of water during the weeks of pollination, and those weeks are right now in July. A projection by the Spanish Agricultural Research Institute (SEEC), released internally, but not yet to the press, estimates crop losses of 40 to 60% for corn and sunflowers in Extremadura and Andalusia. When harvests of this magnitude are lost in regions that supply not only Spain but the entire European export chain, the next step is food inflation. And food inflation does not affect everyone equally. It starts with the most basic foods and hits lower-income families first, as they spend a larger proportion of their income on food. In countries where the cost of living was already under pressure from the past few years of post-pandemic inflation, this additional burden could be the push that turns economic hardship into a full-blown political crisis. The third set of consequences is the one that requires the most sophisticated analysis to understand, but it is potentially the most enduring. Extreme heat and the accompanying drought are causing the soil to become impermeable. When dry, cracked soil is hit by intense precipitation, the kind of rain that Mediterranean autumns often bring, the water is not absorbed. It runs off. On sloping terrain, this runoff carries away soil, clogs rivers, and transforms areas that survived the dry summer into flash flood zones in the fall. The cycle is not a hot summer followed by a normal fall. It is a hot summer followed by a flood-prone fall, on soil that wildfires have stripped of its protective cover. And then the cycle begins again the following summer, on land that is even more depleted and less able to moderate extremes. Before I finish, I need to speak directly to those who are in these regions right now or have loved ones there. There are concrete and immediate things you can do today, not tomorrow, today. If you're in an affected area, stay hydrated before you feel thirsty, because once thirst sets in, it's already a sign that your body is experiencing water stress. Drink water at 6 a.m. before you go out, and keep a liter of cold water within reach from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m., which is when the heat is at its peak. If you have an elderly neighbor or know someone living alone, call them or go check on them in person this afternoon. Not tomorrow. The time between being fine and organ failure for an elderly person without air conditioning during a heat wave like this can be a matter of hours, not days. Find out now where the nearest cooling center is to your home. In Spain, the AMET Alert app lists the addresses. In France, the municipal website for each Paris arrondissement and each major commune publishes this information. Download your country's weather service app and turn on alert notifications. These alerts exist. The problem is that most people only discover them after they need them. I'll continue monitoring the evolution of the atmospheric block over the Iberian Peninsula and the XMWF models for the next 2 weeks. If the data show any significant change, for better or for worse, I'll be back with an update sooner than the normal schedule would indicate. This community has been following this crisis with a level of attention and seriousness that surprises me with every video. The comments on recent posts have been filled with stories from people in the affected areas, from amateur meteorologists who've shared data from their personal weather stations, and from nurses and doctors on the front lines who've confirmed what the data shows. I read every single one. Thank you for the trust you place in this channel. Please share this video with people in the affected regions, not for engagement, but because a warning that reaches them through the right channel at the right time can literally save a life. Take care of yourselves, stay in the shade wherever you can, and see you in the next video.